All right, we are doing a top five. We're doing an end of the year top five podcasts that I've enjoyed listening to throughout 2022. Welcome to Fusion. My name is Brendan Saunders. Today we are going to discuss the integration of faith and life when it comes to the podcast I listen to. What a fun topic. I'm going to give you the top five podcasts that I've listened to over the past year, and I hope that you will comment and give me yours as well. In fact, before we get into my list, I'm asking you the SNL. I'm asking you to, first of all, subscribe to my channel. Second, I'm asking you to click the notification bell and make sure that you know every time I drop an episode. And then the L in SNL is like. Take a minute, click the thumbs up like button, and like this video. So for me, podcasting is something that I naturally fell into a few years ago. The reason I say I naturally fell into it was because I was already a fan of, and a devotee, if you will, of talk radio. This goes all the way back to my pre-teenage years, frankly. Definitely by the time I was in junior high, I was a fan of morning radio, and specifically where I grew up in. I grew up in the state of Connecticut. I'm in the New York metro area, and I would listen to Imus in the morning, every morning as I prepared to go to school. Now, Imus's chief rival was Howard Stern, and so I listened to Howard a little bit, but it just wasn't really my bag of tea. I always felt that Imus was much smarter in his humor and in his approach, whereas Howard Stern just absolutely tried to push the envelope. And so I appreciated the attempt to be smart. It was in my college years that I started listening to Rush Limbaugh. And I've just always had a thing where I loved talk radio, while others, many of my counterparts, were listening to the radio or to their music incessantly. I usually devoted most of my time in a car, and even time throughout my day, to listening to different talk radio programs, including sports talk. Growing up here in the greater New York area, Mike and the Mad Dog was a staple for afternoon sports radio, sports talk. So that's always been my thing. Whether it's sports talk radio or current events, political talk radio, I've always enjoyed it, which, as I said, made it a very natural transition over to podcasts, because podcasts tend to be topic related and discussions in nature, and so it made sense for me to do that. So for many years now, I've been into podcasts, and now with phones and all sorts of platforms like Apple Podcast and Google Podcast, and Pandora now has podcasts, and iHeartRadio app now has podcasts. So you can get podcasts everywhere. I will put the link to each of the podcasts that I talk about here in the description, but I will also tell you my go-to place to get podcasts is actually a site called Podbay. So if I'm looking for a podcast, I will generally put in the name of the person or the name of their podcast, and then put Podbay at the end of my search. So if I'm looking for, say, Fusion with Brendan Saunders, I would put Fusion with Brendan Saunders Podbay. Podbay is an aggregator. It's a podcast player, so you can play the podcast from the site, whether you're doing that on your computer or on your phone. But I always download them to my phone, and they're basically an aggregator. So podcasts. If a podcast is a podcast of any note, it's going to be there. Last thing I will say before I get to my top five list is that the first thing you will probably notice is that my list is not full of Christian podcasts. Exactly. By now you ought to know me. I'm the contrarian. By now you ought to know me. I believe that Christians need to be well-rounded. They need to understand what's going on around them. They need to understand their culture. They need to enjoy. Life was made to enjoy. Read Ecclesiastes. Life was made to enjoy it, and there's nothing overtly anti-Christian by listening to media or entertainment that isn't particularly Christian. What you should be doing through the power of the Spirit and your own noggin is being able to assess when something is or isn't material worth spending a lot of your time on, or that sort of thing, right? God has given you a brain, use it, is what I have always said, and enjoy life. And so some of my podcasts are Christian, but they are not all. Most of them are not. So these are the podcasts. I'm going to start with an OLI. An OLI is an outside looking in. In other words, this podcast didn't make the top 5. It's just on the outside, but it is a podcast that nonetheless I still listen to a little bit, not as much as I used to, and that is the Dan Le Batard Show. So up until this year, it probably would have been my number 1. If I had done this in previous years, and I am hoping to do this list every year to see how these things change, if I'd done this in any previous iteration, Dan would have been my number 1 podcast. I used to devote 3 to 4 hours a day to listening to the Dan Le Batard podcast. Dan Le Batard for years was a writer for the Miami Herald. In more recent years, he had a show on ESPN with his father that he did after Pardon the Interruption for ESPN fans, called Highly Questionable. He has since 2003 or 4, he has had a local radio show down in Miami. And that's where I started listening to him. I went down to Miami one time around 0405. I heard him on the radio down there. I knew him as a writer, and I started listening to that. And in the early days, I would stream his show at work. While I was at work working, I would stream his show. And now he's in full podcast. He's no longer on the radio airs. He has a podcast. Unfortunately, let me start by saying, you have to get the show. There's a lot of inside jokes. He's one of those shows, and a lot of these podcasts are this way. You start listening, and at first, you don't necessarily understand everything, but over the space of weeks and months, you get to understand exactly what the show is about. I've always said that about radio shows or about podcasts, is that you got to give them some time. You got to give them some time so that you understand exactly what it is they're doing. And one of the favorite lines of the Le Batard Show is, "You don't get the show." What I loved about Le Batard was that he talked about sports, but he talked about it within the context of life. What I liked about Dan was that while I knew that his politics were left, he was always an open microphone for those of dissenting view. But I found this year that was not the case anymore, and that's why I've kind of moved away from him, because frankly I'm very disappointed in him. In particular, he had a podcast episode where he invited on Michelle Tafoya, who had been a sideline reporter for many years, and a co-worker or in the same field with Dan. They'd been friends for many years. Michelle Tafoya recently stepped away from her sideline reporting job in order to start her own podcast. Dan had her on the show, and I think Dan punked out. Instead of talking with her and allowing somebody who had a different view from him on different topics, Dan allowed his producer, a super woke pain in the butt, to basically attack her the whole time and was unapologetic about it. And so I didn't like how that shake down. So I don't spend as much time. There's literally one day of the week, his Tuesday program, that has certain things that he does every Tuesday and certain people that he has on that I really enjoy. So I make sure I don't miss Tuesdays. But you know what? He's on the outside looking in these days. I just don't invest as much time in his podcast anymore. Which brings us to our official number 5, which is the aforementioned Michelle Tafoya. Now, if you go and Google Dan Le Batard, Michelle Tafoya, you will find all sorts of articles about that particular episode. It's all over the internet. And interestingly enough, I think that a gentleman named Jason Whitlock, who was a writer for years, who now is also a podcaster, Jason Whitlock, I thought did the best breakdown of how bad that and what was wrong with that particular episode where Dan Le Batard's producers attacked Michelle Tafoya because of her views. Having said that, because of that, I started listening to Michelle. I was like, oh, let me hear what her podcast is about. And so it's called Sideline Sanity with Michelle Tafoya. As I said, after years of being a sideline reporter, probably the premier sideline reporter in the NFL, and covering the NBA, the Olympics, college football, you name it all, Michelle Tafoya now has her own podcast that comes out daily, and it's great. She has on folks. She talks with folks, and she has on folks, and I really enjoy it. And it's a down to earth discussion. She would not consider herself to be far right. She would consider herself to be reasonably right of center, but willing to open and discuss matters, whether it's topics or whether it's things from the left or the right, willing to have on guests who talk about it. And so I have found a lot of her, the folks that she has on, and a lot of the discussions that she has said. For instance, she recently talked to both Bob Costas and Coach Tony Dungy. So she's having great people on. She's having these 45-minute discussions. If you don't know the world of podcasting, most podcasts last about 45 minutes. And so if you do a search for Sideline Sanity with Michelle Tafoya, you will find it on multiple platforms, Apple and all those. As I said, my link that I will put in the description will have it from Podbay. She is my number 5 podcast for 2022. My number 4 is the Tony Kornheiser Show. Tony Kornheiser is another former, actually he still is an ESPN personality. He still is the co-host of Pardon the Interruption with Michael Wilbon. Every afternoon at 5 o'clock or every evening at 5 o'clock, they sit across the table from each other and talk about sports. I discovered Tony Kornheiser, his radio show. It was originally a radio show on ESPN Radio back in the late 90s. I discovered it, and I immediately loved it because, once again, he talked about sports, but he talked about it from the context of life. That was what, again, I kind of mentioned before, attracted me to Dan Le Batard, is this idea that they could talk about sports, but they weren't this hardcore, sports is everything and you're ridiculous if you don't follow sports. No, they put sports in the proper context. I think professional sports should be put in the proper context, which is that you have a life to live, and you should have a life outside of whatever your favorite teams are. And they talk about their life, and Tony talks about his life and what's going on, and he lives down in Washington, D.C., and so he talks from that spectrum of what's going on in D.C. and what's going on in his life. He as well is no longer on terrestrial radio. He is only on podcast, and I suggest that you go listen to the Tony Kornheiser Show, which again, I will put the link, but it is very easy. He actually has a website. A lot of podcasts don't have a website because they're just picked up by the aggregators, but he does. You can go to TonyKornheisershow.com to catch his podcast. He is one of my favorites. He puts out podcasts 3 times a week, so generally 3 hours of my week does go to Tony. Number 3, my third favorite podcast from this year is a friend of mine. It's called Post Game with Paul Golden. You've probably never heard of Paul Golden, but as I said, he is actually a friend of mine. He comes from my alma mater, Clark Summit University, where he is on staff there. I knew him when I attended the school. We are still friends. And here's what's great about Post Game with Paul Golden. Paul is currently serves as the chaplain of the Yankees AAA baseball team. Their AAA team is located in Scranton-Wilkes-Barre. That's where Clark Summit University is, up in that area. And Paul has served now for years as their chaplain. He also serves as the chaplain for the minor league hockey team for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So Paul has put in years now of being a chaplain, and he's been around Yankee stars when they were in the minor league and hockey stars when they were in the minor league. And he's been around the sports world quite a bit. And now he has this great podcast that I really enjoy. He usually puts out 2 podcasts a month where he talks to people. So for instance, he has podcasts where he talks to Scott Brocious. He has podcasts where he talks to Clint Hurdle. He has podcasts where he talks to Andy Pettit. Here is somebody who poured into the spiritual lives of players at a volatile time in their life as they were just learning to navigate, professional sports. And here he was to help pour into their life and minister to them. So the stories that they tell him, the intimacy that he shares with these folks is really incredible. And it isn't just athletes that he talks to, and it isn't just former Yankees that he talks to. He talks to people across the spectrum. He talks to agents. He talks to scouts. He talks to all these different people that he's come across in that ministry. And so he's my number 3. My number 2, quickly becoming my number 1, is The Verdict with Ted Cruz. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas 3 years ago launched a podcast. I always kind of knew about it. I'd poke in on it from time to time, but it seems like over the past year, he has absolutely become so timely because he has the ability to break down what's happening in Washington, to just break down exactly what's going on. It doesn't matter whether it was when President Trump was in office or whether it's now with President Biden. He has this ability. It's what I love about him. He's Ivy League educated. He's a lawyer, and yet he has this ability to break down what's going on in such an understandable fashion, to let you know exactly in those walls of Congress, in those vaunted walls of the Capitol of our country. He's the guy who can break down exactly what's going on. I have fallen in love with his podcast this year. It was previously independent. He signed a deal with iHeartRadio. So they're disseminating it. He puts out 3 episodes a week. Episodes are generally 30 to 40 minutes in length. They deal with whatever topics are going on. And as I said, he's also very funny, by the way. One of the great things that all of these podcasts have in common, if you know me, you know that I like to have fun. I like to joke. I like to play around. I like to take serious things and shine the humor that's in even serious things. And Ted is able to do that. And frankly, all the podcasts that I mentioned are podcasts with hosts and people who can take even serious topics or very deep topics and can find humor in them and can present them in a way that is entertaining. Which leads us to my number 1 podcast, my absolute favorite podcast. And my wife is going to hate this because she hates this podcast so much. Listen, I have to give fair warning. This is not a Christian podcast. It is nowhere close to a Christian podcast. You should keep your kids away from this podcast. Do not listen to this podcast if you have sensibilities. If you have sense, don't listen to this podcast. And if you have reasonable and Christian sensibilities, don't listen to this podcast. Isn't that great that I have to say all that stuff about this podcast before I even mention it? This podcast is called Cinephobe. It is hosted by 3 gentlemen, Zach Harper, Amin Elhassan, and Anthony May. Zach Harper and Amin Elhassan are both basketball reporters. Amin Elhassan actually worked for a decade. He worked in basketball. He started with a job with the Phoenix Suns. He's worked with 2 other organizations since then. Zach Harper has done basketball commentary, has his own show, his own radio show. And then Anthony Mays, they brought him as their producer, and they found his personality was so good that they brought him in on the podcast. Now, why do I love this podcast called Cinephobe, which only drops 1 episode a week? Believe me, you can't take more than 1 episode of this each week. The episodes are a minimum of an hour and a half long. And why do I love it? I love, first of all, the premise. Cinephobe, movie fear or movie hatred, right? So the idea of Cinephobe is that they go back and they look at movies that are poorly rated by the critics. In fact, a movie has to have a Rotten Tomatoes score of 40% or less for them to even consider doing a show on it. So they basically go back and they look at movies from out the years, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever. They look at movies that were just panned by the critics, and they determine, hey, did that movie get a fair shake, or were the critics correct? That's the premise. And I love that premise because if we're honest, we all have movies that we know either didn't do well in the movie theater or that other people, they're like our hidden little sins that we don't want to tell people that we actually like that movie. And these are the types of movies that they talk about in each episode. They pick one movie per episode and they go through the movie. This is why it's an hour and a half long, because they literally go through the whole movie, giving an overview scene by scene, reading out what's happening and giving their commentary as they do it. And then at the end, they make a decision. Should we phobe this and say, yeah, this was a horrible movie that nobody should watch and the critics were correct? Or should we file this? Should we decide we love this movie even though the critics didn't like it? Now, again, I can't stress this enough. They swear, they curse, they talk about things that are totally inappropriate. And if you have Christian sensibilities, you should not go anywhere near this podcast. But if you, like me, have a dark soul that has movies that I look at in the past that I go, man, I just love that movie. I'll put it to you this way. One of the first episodes that they grabbed me with was for the movie Last Action Hero. Most people don't even know what the movie Last Action Hero is. It was an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. At the height of Arnold's popularity, he did a movie called Last Action Hero, which was supposed to be a satire on action movies. So instead of just being hardcore Arnold Schwarzenegger blowing people up, this would be this meta breaking the fourth wall type movie that would actually make fun of the genre. It did horribly. It was literally Arnold Schwarzenegger's first bomb as a movie. When they did that, when I saw that they did that episode and I listened to that episode, I enjoyed it so much that I was hooked. And now, even though the episode drops on Thursdays, every Saturday, I get up and I say to my wife, you know what Saturday is? Saturday's Cinephobe Day. I download this because, again, you need to be able to have an hour and a half to 2 hours of your time. And generally on Saturdays, I'm doing something. I'm either doing my yard work, we're doing things around the house, or on Saturdays, lots of times I go for a long walk. And so I have this extended period of time to listen to this podcast that I'm telling you, don't go near it. I don't want to hear from you. I don't want to hear in the comments how horrible it is and how dare a Christian listen to this. I don't want to hear it. I've warned you. But this for me is one of my absolute favorite. It is now loaded with inside jokes, so you are going to have to listen to it for a while before you get the inside jokes. However, I will tell you this. They have done episodes where they explain the inside jokes. In fact, if you go to between episode 149 and episode 150, and by the way, episode 149, they did the movie Venom. Episode 150, they did the first Hulk with Eric Bana? I don't know how he pronounces his name. And in between that is an episode called the Xenophobe Glossary, where they actually sit and for 2 hours, they go through all of their inside jokes and explain which episode that came from and how it became one of their running inside jokes. So they even give you that, by the way. Episode 148, Green Lantern, right? I'm telling you, these are just great movies. Episode 147, Man on Fire, right? So they are going over these movies, and they, as I said, they go through it, and they give their commentary, and there's so much that to laugh about. But again, it is not at all Christian material. It is three guys who are clearly pagans. They all admit it. They all admit that they're pagans. Looking at movies and trying to decide, did this movie get a fair shake by the folks who rated it and judged it. It is my number one favorite podcast. And for a person who almost every time I get in the car, a podcast goes on, my wife will listen to many of my podcasts. She'll listen to Tony Kornheiser. She'll listen to almost anything I put on there, Ted Cruz. but if I put Cinephobe on, she will not stand it. They're a bunch of idiots as far as she's concerned. They're idiots talking about idiotic movies in an idiotic way, and she cannot stand it. It is a waste of her time, and maybe that's part of why I like it so much. So, the number one podcast for 2022, Cinephobe, with Zach Harper, Amin El Hassan, and Anthony Mays. Please hit me up in the comments and tell me, what are your favorite podcasts? Do you listen to only Christian podcasts? You know, one of the other things that I don't like about Christian podcasts is that most Christian podcasts are actually just sermons, right? So if you look for, say, a Tony Evans podcast, all you're going to find is his sermons. I don't want that. I actually would like to hear Christians talking about stuff. I think that's what made the original version of Fusion. And again, I say this every time, that if you look in the description, you can click on a link that will take you back to our Libsyn page and will take you back to our 150 episodes that we did of this podcast when it was me and my team of young adults. What I always thought was great and unique about us was that we talked about life through the lens of faith. In other words, we didn't try to be a Christian podcast. And there are episodes where we laugh and talk about that, how Christians rejected us. We had some folks at the very beginning who said that they wouldn't support us because our podcast wasn't, quote, Christian enough, because Christians sitting in the room talking about life wasn't good enough, right? I thought that's what made us unique. I thought that we deserved to be on Christian radio, because again, Christian radio, they're either playing music or they're playing sermons. How about let's just talk about life? And by the way, if you're in any way affiliated with any Christian radio station and you want somebody who can do that, I would love to do that. So hit me up. Please, I would love to host a Christian radio talk show that is actually talking about the integration of faith into real life. Hit me up in the comments. Make sure you do the SNL, right? Do the SNL. You'll do that for me. Subscribe, notify, like, but also make sure that you hit me up in the comments and tell me what are some of your favorite podcasts. And guess what? Because this was the last episode of the year, you got a bonus. This is a 20-minute episode. Usually my episodes are 10 to 15 minutes. I just poured out my heart to you for 25 minutes on what I think are what were the 5 best podcasts for me. So please do me that favor and click the like button. Leave me a comment with your favorite podcast. And then we'll see what comes up for 2023, who we all like in 23. I will leave you as I always leave you. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your Lord. I look forward to seeing you in 2023.